Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. In 1989, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child called for a ban on corporal punishment of kids. Corporal punishment was defined in part as any punishment in which physical force is issued and intended to cause some degree of pain or discomfort, however light. According to the committee, the most common forms of corporal punishment are smacking, slapping, or spanking with the hand or an implement such as a wooden spoon, stick, or belt. And many countries have since outright banned corporal punishment. Others have banned spanking in some settings, and a few countries have not enforced any bans. If you want to know where your country sits, you can take a look at this website. As far as I'm aware, this call to ban corporal punishment of kids was mostly driven by it being a human rights issue. Now, I don't want to disagree with that position, but this website, of course, is all about what research says about different aspects of parenting. And some people may not be convinced by the UN argument. So in this video, I'm going to discuss the evidence concerning whether corporal punishment is a more effective approach for managing child behaviour problems than other non-physical discipline strategies. And many studies have been conducted to determine the effectiveness of corporal punishment in terms of its capacity to reduce child behaviour problems. Over the years, this research has been synthesized in several meta-analytic reviews. Now, only one of these meta-analyses, by Lazaire and Kuhn, has reported evidence suggesting that corporal punishment can effectively reduce child behavior problems. Specifically, these researchers distinguished 4 types of corporal punishment. One of these was called conditional spanking, which was defined as physical punishment used as a backup to other forms of discipline, such as timeout, used in response to defiance, or used in a controlled manner. The results reported by Lazaire and Kuhn suggested that conditional spanking was the only form of corporal punishment that was supposedly more effective in reducing behavioral problems in kids than other non-physical discipline strategies. So in the following, I'll focus on the evidence for conditional spanking. And I'll do this by first reviewing each of the conditional spanking studies considered by Lazaire and Kuhn in their meta-analysis. I'll then comment on the meta-analysis itself, highlighting what I reckon are the problems with this study. So, in Lazaire and Kuhn's meta-analysis, 9 studies examined conditional spanking, and these studies fall into 2 categories. First are randomised controlled trials, and second are observational studies. Now, if you want to know more about RCTs, you can check out my video in the link below. But by observational studies, I mean studies looking at the association between the use of conditional spanking and child behaviour outcomes. I'll start by discussing the RCTs before then moving on to the observational studies. So there were 4 RCTs in Lazaire and Kuhn's meta-analysis. These RCTs had the same basic methodology. Each involved recruiting kids who were 2 to 6 years old and had behavioural problems such as non-compliance, aggression, and/or tantrums. Mum and child were assigned either to an experimental condition or to a control condition, and test sessions took place in a clinic room. Now, if mum and kid were in the experimental condition, then during the test session, mum had to give the kid instructions and the kid was supposed to carry these out. If the kid didn't follow the instructions, then they were first given a warning. And if they still didn't follow the instructions, they were sent to timeout. 3 different experimental conditions were used across the studies. The main ways in which these conditions differed was in terms of how timeout was administered. So first of all, there was a child decision condition. And here, the kid decided when they would leave timeout. Second was mum decision plus barrier condition. So mum decided when the kid could leave timeout, and if the kid left timeout early, they were put in a closet with a light on, door left open, and a 4-foot barrier in place of the door for 1 minute before then going back into timeout. And the third condition was mum decision plus spanking. So again, mum decided when the kid could leave timeout, and if the kid escaped timeout early, they were spanked twice on the butt with an open hand and sent back into timeout. Now, if the mum and child were in the control condition, then during the test session, mum gave the kid instructions, and again, the kid was supposed to carry these out. But in this condition, no consequences for non-compliance were used. So in each study, the primary outcome was child compliance with mum's instructions. And here are the results. So in general, kids in the experimental conditions tended to show higher levels of compliance than kids in the control condition. In other words, having a consequence for non-compliance produced higher levels of compliance than having no consequence. Kids in the mum decision plus spanking condition displayed comparable levels of compliance to kids in the mum decision plus barrier condition. In one study, kids in the mum decision plus spanking condition showed higher levels of compliance than kids in the child decision condition. However, in a subsequent study, there was no difference between these 2 conditions. So what can you make of these results? Well, you might be tempted to say that they show spanking is helpful, because kids in the mum decision plus spanking condition showed higher levels of compliance than kids in the control condition, where no spanking was used. And setting aside the mixed results, there was also evidence that kids in the mum decision plus spanking condition showed higher levels of compliance than kids in the child decision condition, again where no spanking was used. But here's the big problem. Finding that the mum decision plus spanking condition produced higher levels of compliance compared to the control condition, or finding that the mum decision plus spanking condition produced higher levels of compliance compared to the child decision condition, does not enable you to make claims about the effectiveness of spanking. Now, this is because, compared to the control condition, the mum decision plus spanking condition involved use of timeout and spanking. Compared to the child decision condition, the mum decision plus spanking condition involved both mum deciding when timeout was over and the use of spanking. Thus, in each case, the mum decision plus spanking condition differed from the comparison condition in two ways. Now, this means that any difference between the conditions could have been due to one or other, or both, of the differences between the conditions. You just don't know. Consequently, you're not able to draw any conclusions about spanking. The only comparison that would enable you to say something about spanking would be between the mum decision plus spanking condition and the mum decision plus barrier condition. And that's because the only difference between these two conditions is whether or not spanking was used. But as mentioned, there was no difference between these conditions. If anything, the results favour the latter barrier condition. So in summary, these studies mostly don't enable conclusions about the effectiveness of spanking. And the findings that do, if anything, support not using spanking. So now I'm going to move on to the observational studies. So Lazare and Kuhn considered 5 observational studies. In the following, I'll briefly discuss each study, the findings obtained, and the problems with each study. So first of all, Chapman and Zahn-Welko recruited 24 kids aged between 10 to 20 months. In this study, mums were asked to immediately record, after every emotional incident involving their kid, a detailed description of what happened. And they had to do this for 9 months, which is pretty ambitious. And the major issue with this study is that instances of spanking were recorded in a physical coercion category, along with other types of physical discipline strategies, such as holding the child. Now, this means that you can't draw any conclusions about the impact of spanking on child misbehavior. That is, any effects involving the physical coercion category could be attributed to the other physical discipline strategies included in the category, rather than spanking. At any rate, there was no evidence that physical coercion was associated with higher levels of child compliance with parental instruction. Next, Lazare recruited 40 kids who were 25 to 38 months of age. Mums kept a diary in which they recorded discipline incidents related to instances where the kid was fighting or not complying with parental requests. Now, like the previous study, instances of spanking were lumped into a corporal punishment category, this time along with hand slapping. So again, this study also can't tell you anything about spanking, because any effects involving the corporal punishment category could be attributed to hand slapping rather than spanking. At any rate, the outcome of interest in this study was the delay between instances of fighting or non-compliance. There was no evidence that corporal punishment was more effective than non-corporal punishment, that is, timeout and removal of privileges, in terms of a longer delay until the next incident of fighting or non-compliance. So now on to Strauss and Moradian, who recruited about 900 mums and their kids who were aged 2 to 14 years old. Mums were interviewed over the phone and they answered a bunch of questions related to their kids' antisocial behaviour and discipline strategies. There were 2 problems with this study. First, once more, spanking was rolled together with other forms of physical punishment into a corporal punishment category. So the results of this study did not permit conclusions about spanking and child behaviour problems. The second problem was the approach to data analysis. And in an early version of this video, I went into detail explaining these problems, but it's just way too much. To sum up, and without wanting to be rude, the analysis was a mess, and I would place very little faith in the reported findings. So I think best to ignore this study. So next, Ritchie, who recruited 93-year-old kids. Mums completed a bunch of phone interviews in which they were asked to describe conflicts with their child. The researchers coded the interviews in terms of the types of behaviour kids displayed and the types of disciplinary strategies that mums used. The relevant analyses looked at the likelihood of the kid complying with a request by mum following each type of disciplinary strategy. Now, Ritchie found that the only disciplinary strategies associated with increased levels of compliance were ignoring the kid and grabbing the kid or physically forcing them to comply. There was no evidence to support the use of spanking. So lastly, Yarrow recruited about 85 kids who were between 3 to 6 years old. Kids' mums and teachers completed a bunch of questionnaires. Now, I had a lot of trouble working out what was going on in this study, and I can't be confident of summarizing it properly. This is partly because I looked at the numbers that Lazare and Kuhn pulled out for their meta-analysis. I have zero idea how they came up with the numbers they did. I think if anything, there was some evidence to show that kids who were spanked for being aggressive towards their siblings showed less aggression towards kids at school. But there was no such relationship when you looked at a measure of spanking in general, and no evidence that this effect was different from non-physical forms of discipline. In summary, again, these studies mostly don't enable conclusions about the effectiveness of spanking, and the findings that do support not using spanking, maybe with the exception of yellow, but I can't be confident of that. So far, not looking good for spanking. Now on to Lazaler and Kuhn's meta-analysis. So there were two key types of child behavioural problems considered by Lazaler and Kuhn in their meta-analysis. The first was non-compliance with parental requests, and the second was antisocial behaviour. Now, all you need to know about the next bit is that for each of the individual studies included, that is the ones I just discussed, Lazaler and Kuhn computed a value called an effect size, which reflects how big of an impact spanking had on reducing non-compliance and or antisocial behaviour. Then they did the same for a bunch of other non-physical disciplinary strategies. Next, they lumped the non-physical disciplinary strategies together into a single category and examined whether spanking was more effective in reducing non-compliance and antisocial behaviour compared to these other disciplinary strategies. What they found was that spanking was supposedly more effective in reducing child behaviour problems compared to these other strategies. However, I reckon these results are flawed for two reasons. First, and probably the most significant problem, 7 of the 9 studies Lazaler and Kuhn drew effect sizes from, for the reasons previously discussed, did not permit conclusions concerning the impact of spanking on child behaviour problems. That is because spanking was lumped together with some other form of discipline. Second, Lazaler and Kuhn did what I would consider to be odd stuff with the data from Ritchie. Specifically, they computed an effect size which reflected if a child was showing a problem behaviour, X, the likelihood that they would no longer display this behaviour following disciplining strategy Y. So what I think they were wanting to look at was, for example, if a kid was complaining and then they were spanked, what's the likelihood the kid would still be complaining? Now, to illustrate what I think the problem with this is, suppose you have Johnny who's been shoplifting. That is the problem behaviour. He gets sent to juvenile detention for a month. That's your disciplinary strategy. Now he gets out and he's no longer shoplifting. Was juvie an effective approach? Well, you might think yes until you hear that Johnny is now going around committing armed robbery. That is, looking at whether a kid is still showing a problem behaviour following delivery of some disciplinary strategy is not all that interesting, because they may have started engaging in some other potentially more serious problem behaviour. These conceptually flawed effect sizes featured heavily in Lazaler and Kuhn's meta-analysis, and potentially drove the supposed benefits of spanking. So I don't think the findings from this meta-analysis can demonstrate whether spanking is more effective in reducing child behaviour problems than non-physical disciplinary strategies. So putting this all together, in my view, there is zero evidence to show that spanking is more effective in reducing child behaviour problems than non-physical disciplinary strategies. And then you can consider the other meta-analyses I mentioned. These do not find any support for the effectiveness of spanking. If anything, their findings suggest it's detrimental. Thus, aside from the convincing human rights argument against spanking, the research evidence provides no support for its use. So that's it for spanking. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.